Welcome to the webinar. This is a webinar on mnemonic devices. My name is Paul Novak. I'm the founder and program director of Iris Reading, and this is one webinar in a memory improvement course that we're doing. It's a series of 10 webinars, all to help you improve your memory with a variety of tips, tricks, and strategies. And a lot of these are very, very useful ways. If you're a student, or maybe not a student, maybe you're a professional and you have to remember just lots of information. Maybe you have to remember names. Maybe you have to remember more of what you read. Maybe you have to remember things for a speech that you're giving or a presentation. A lot of these things that we're talking about in this series are very useful. So today the topic is mnemonic devices. And mnemonic devices are useful for a variety of reasons. Now, I know some of you attending today's webinar probably already know what mnemonic devices are, and some of you might not. So let me go over a quick review of what they are. Simply put, I would say mnemonic devices provide an easy way to remember hard things. So the easy stuff, we don't need strategies to remember the easy stuff because we already remember the easy stuff. By that I mean, our names, the names of our parents, close friends. But the harder things, maybe the things we're studying in school or the things we have to remember for work, that's where we can use mnemonic devices. And I want you to think about your memory. And I like to think about how your memory works in two ways. There's the input and the output. The input being retention and the output being recall. Or in other words, retention is what you learn and recall is, what you can recall. What do you remember? Because sometimes we can't remember what we remember, if that makes any sense. What I mean by that is, sometimes let's say you were cramming all night for a test, or you were really reading something, and then somebody asks you, what was that about? And you've just got a blank stare. Your mind goes blank sometimes. Or, you studied for the test, and then you get to the test, and you can't remember all the things that you studied. Now, it doesn't mean that none of that got into your head. A lot of times, the information is there. We're just having trouble with the recall. And later on, we're like, oh, yeah, that was the answer to that question. Too bad the test is already over. Or you ever have the tip of the tongue phenomenon happen to you? That's where, you might say there's something that you know that you have it in your head, you just can't remember what it is. So sometimes you might be like, oh, there's this restaurant that you should really check out. And someone's like, oh, what's the name? And you're like, oh, boy, it starts with the letter, and you just can't remember. And then finally it hits you. There are things that trigger you to recall information. And that's really what mnemonic devices are. They're there to trigger you to recall information that you already learned. Okay? Now, there are a variety of ways to get the information into your head with retention. That's not what we're going to focus on in this webinar, so we're going to focus on mnemonic devices which help you recall. So keep in mind with your memory, you have retention and then you have recall. We're going to be focusing this webinar on recall, and mnemonic devices are great ways to recall information that you already have learned. Now, there are various types of mnemonic devices. They can be visual images. They can be something called acrostics, which is a fancy name for basically taking the first, they sometimes call it a first letter mnemonic, or an acrostic can also be like making a sentence. You'll see in a moment because I'm going to give you some examples of acrostics. Mnemonic devices can also be acronyms. Sometimes they're rhymes or alliteration, and they can also utilize chunking. And I'll give you an example of one of the first mnemonic devices that I was ever exposed to. There was a time where you had no clue what this was, right? There was a time where you had to learn this. Now, all of us know that this is a compass, but once upon a time, you were taught this by someone. They said, okay, here's what a compass is. You got north, that's over here, east over here, is north, south, east, and west. How do you remember what goes where? And I know it's obvious now because you've seen, compasses over and over again on maps. But when I was learning this, I remember my teacher, the mnemonic device she gave us was never eat sour wheat. Now notice how that rhymes. And notice how it's also a visual image. This is the mnemonic type. It's a visual image and a rhyme. Visual image because it's an actual compass that I can see. N for never means north. Eat, obviously east. Sour is south, and west is going to be wheat. Never eat sour wheat. And rhyming can always make it stick a little better. Now, there are other variations of this, like never eat soggy waffles. Or sour waffles. I put their sour over here. It's supposed to be soggy, but it could be sour waffles, soggy waffles, whatever you want. But the idea is that you're simply taking something and turning it into some kind of a rhyme. Now, one other question you might have is, how would a little kid know which way to go? Because you've got to go this way, right? If I did never eat sour wheat, I'd have it backwards. So our teacher instructed us, well, just go clockwise. And we already had learned clocks up to that point, so we knew that clockwise meant this way. And we knew, think about how she taught us that. It's something called association. This is another big memory principle. Anytime you can associate information with something you already learned, it'll stick better. Actually, some people argue that the only way that we learn anything is by associating it to previous knowledge. So, never eat sour wheat, and the teacher telling me to go clockwise is a way to associate it to something I already know, a clock. And now I've got this rhyme, and that's the first example of a mnemonic device that I was exposed to. Now, there's other types of mnemonic devices as well. For example, what if you had to recall what the Great Lakes are? Now, I know we're doing this as a webinar, so this is a geographic mnemonic device that we would use. That would be probably, if you're in the U.S., you probably are familiar with the Great Lakes. They're around the Midwest. If you're not in the U.S., you might not be familiar with this, but keep in mind, mnemonic devices take information that you already know. Now, some people might, like for me, the first Great Lake that would come to mind would be Lake Michigan, only because I live in Chicago, and we are right on the lake, on Lake Michigan. But if somebody asked me really quickly to name them, I would be like Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Erie, and I would be you'd have a few ums in there. I would be like, what? And then finally I would start thinking, did I get them all? Are there 4? Are there 5? Are there 6? And then so believe it or not, there's a mnemonic device for remembering the Great Lakes. You might even be familiar with it. It's simply HOMES. The word or acronym, you can think of it, HOMES. So to remember the Great Lakes, just remember the word HOMES. And then you'll remember, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and Lake Superior. So that's an example of that being applied in a geographic sense. But let's talk about some other ones. Actually, what I would think actually would be more useful, how many days are in these months? How many days are in January? April, June, July, November. Because some months have 30, some have 31. Of course, February is the easiest one to remember. Why? Because February is one of the months where it's just a little out of the ordinary. It has 28 days, and then there's a leap year. But how do we remember all these other things? Now, you can use a mnemonic device to remember how many days are in all of the months of the year. And the mnemonic device is actually a visual mnemonic device. You simply look at your hands, your knuckles, to be specific. And anytime you have a knuckle, that means there's 31 days. So January, if you look at your left knuckle, the first one, that's January. And then there's a dip. That means February. We know February has 28. That's easy. But then March, there's a knuckle right there. That means 31. April, there's a little dip. See that little valley? That's 30 days. May has 31, and so on. You got June with 30, July with 31, and then you go over to your next knuckle on the other hand, and August has 31. September has 30. And this is how you basically remember how many days are in a particular month. You can just stare at your knuckles, and it's a mnemonic device that, just happens to work. Let's take some other examples of mnemonic devices. What about the order of the colors in the rainbow? So what I mean by that is the colors in the rainbow represent the visible spectrum of light and what we can see. You can remember this name, Roy G. Biv. So Roy G. Biv stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So this is an example of a mnemonic device to remember the colors of the rainbow, but not just the colors, it's actually the colors in order. Okay, so the order of the colors in the rainbow, in the visible spectrum. And again, you see what's going on here. These are just simply, this is a name. We can think of it as a guy, Roy G. Biv, and every letter stands for one of the, and then after that it becomes pretty easy to figure out that, all of these are the different colors, red, orange, yellow, and so on. So if you had a test, you would review, obviously, these colors a few times, and then you would just make sure that you memorized Roy G. Biv instead of trying to memorize these in a particular order. I think all of us would agree, if I covered up Roy G. Biv, and I just took away this slide, and I asked you to name them, without knowing Roy G. Biv, it would be harder to recall them. I mean, try recalling them right now without Without knowing that name, it's difficult. So we see how that helps us out. Now, an important thing to know about mnemonic devices when you're creating them, or when you look at common mnemonic devices, anytime you can use humor, absurdity, or vulgarity, or any kind of exaggeration, that'll make the mnemonic stick even better. And if you've been to one of our other webinars, a lot of the webinars when we're talking about different techniques, when we're using a certain kind of a technique and we're trying to create like a visual image, we try to make that image a little exaggerated or absurd or even funny. That way it sticks out. If it's just mundane and ordinary, we're not going to remember it. So keep that in mind if you're creating your own mnemonics. Now, we're going to talk about how to create our own mnemonics in a moment, but let's take a few more examples that are actually a little humorous or absurd. So here's, let's say we have to remember the bones of the skull. And there's you can see the diagram right here. And let's say we study this diagram over and over again. We might still kind of forget these things. Now, what if we just had to name them? Well, there's a mnemonic device for that. Just like there's an app for that. You know how they always say there's an app for that? There's a mnemonic. If you're trying to memorize anything, let's say you're in school right now, there's usually a mnemonic device for that. So anytime you're trying to remember something, if you can't create it on your own, chances are someone else ran into it. So you can just do mnemonic device and then search for the topic on Google. Chances are somebody's already come up with a mnemonic device for that, if you can't come up with one on your own. Now, how would we remember the bones of the skull? There are 6 of them here. How about old people from Texas eat spiders? Remember what we said about absurdity and humor? Well, let's use some humor here. Old people from Texas eat spiders. I apologize if anyone is listening in from Texas. No hard feelings here, but if I'm trying to remember something, the T for temporal bone just happens to line up with Texas, so I had to use that. So old people from Texas eat spiders is going to help me before I go into this test, let's say, to remember the bones of the skull. And it's funny because these mnemonic devices will stick sometimes for a long time. Remember I showed you that mnemonic device of a compass? This compass is, I don't know when I learned this. I think it was like 1st or 2nd grade. And it still sticks with me to today. Wherever I see now a compass, obviously it's not like I'm trying to figure out where's north, where's south. I know that very easily, but I'll still think of that little rhyme because it sticks. So that's how we remember, the bones, how we can remember the bones of the skull. What about something a little more complex in the area of science? What if we had to remember the metric system, the prefixes? And not in a specific order, from largest to smallest. So we've got kilo, hecto, deca, base, deci, centi, milli. How do we remember, we got to remember this, let's say. Well, there's a mnemonic device for that. How about kangaroos hop down British driveways carrying M&Ms? So how would we remember this weird sentence? We would just repeat it to ourselves a few times. Kangaroos hop down British driveways carrying M&Ms. You can also try to picture it and visualize a kangaroo hopping down a British driveway carrying M&Ms. Okay? Now, obviously, with this mnemonic device, the first letter of each word in that sentence is referencing one of the things on top. So kilo, hecto, deca, base, and so on. Well, it's important to know that you need to know first the metric system prefixes. And then, in terms of order, the sentence is just helping you out with the order. This is an example, the type of mnemonic device, this is what they call an acrostic. An acrostic is simply, think of acrostic as a cross. You're going across the line and you're trying to turn it into a sentence, or you're taking the first letter of each thing that you need to remember and you're turning it into some kind of a sentence. So this is one example, but let's say you don't like this. Let's say you don't like kangaroos hop down British driveways carrying M&Ms. Well, there's other ways to do this. You can think of, you come up with another crazy sentence. How about King Henry died by drinking chocolate milk? Okay, that's a little odd. Maybe that one's easier to remember. King Henry died by drinking chocolate milk. Actually, I think this sentence is easier to remember than this one, right? Kangaroos hop down British driveways carrying M&Ms, or King Henry died by drinking chocolate milk. That's so much easier, I think, in my opinion. It's the same amount of words, but the sentence flows better. So that's what I would use to try to remember that as a mnemonic device. What about the planets? Let's talk about the planets. Here's a good example for remembering the planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. So the traditional one is, my very excellent mother just served us nachos. Okay? So my very excellent mother just served us nachos. Well, that stands for Mercury. My very excellent mother just, for Jupiter, served us nachos, for Neptune. Now, you see this little cartoon here. There's another way to do this if you wanted to be a little absurd or vulgar about it. Mary's virgin explanation made Joseph suspect upstairs neighbor. Okay, so let that sink in for a while and choose to remember whichever one you want to remember, and that is what will help you remember the names of the planets. Now, by the way, some people will look at these mnemonic devices and, if you're offended by them or if you're bothered by them, anything that's a little vulgar or a little crazy or exaggerated actually helps you remember better. So this is why you try to create them in that kind of a way. What else can we do? How about the speed of light? It's 299,792,458 meters per second square. Or some people will just round up and they'll say speed of light is about 300 million meters per second square. Well, what if we have to remember it piece by piece? I'm going to introduce to you a mnemonic device that you can apply to any other kind of number. It's called a numbers to letters mnemonic. And what you basically do is you see how there's a 2, a 9, a 7, and so on. You try to take each number and you look for a word that is that many letters. So for 2, I'm looking for a word that has 2 letters. And then I'm looking for one with 9 and one for another word with 9 letters. And what you end up doing is you try to construct a sentence. So if you ever have to remember an exact number, try to come up with a sentence where each one of these words has this many letters. So for example, with 200, with the speed of light, what we can do, we can come up with a sentence like this: we guarantee certainly, clearly referring to this light mnemonic. So I would repeat this a few times. We guarantee certainly, clearly referring to this light mnemonic. So I keep saying this a few times and then finally it gets stuck in my head. And then later on the test, when I have to recall how many, what is the speed of light, I just remember we guarantee certainly, clearly referring to this light mnemonic. I might write that down. And then all I got to do is count how many letters are in each word. Okay, there's 2 letters here, there's 9 right here, there's 9 right here, there's 7 right here, there's 9, and so on. And once you have all those numbers, you've memorized the speed of light. So again, we guarantee certainly, clearly referring to this light mnemonic. That is how we can remember the speed of light. Now, what happens is the more you start doing this if you have to remember a lot of numbers, this can be an extremely good way to do it. The numbers to letters mnemonic is very, very effective. What happens is the more you practice this, you start having certain words that anytime you see something, let's say the number 3, you're going to probably use the word the, because the has 3 letters in it. When you see something like the number 2, you're going to remember, okay, I could either use we because it has 2 letters, or I could use the word no, and it becomes easier to construct these sentences, and if you can make them a little funny, that helps even more. So keep that in mind. This is a good way and you could create it. It takes a little bit of time. I want you to know that these mnemonic devices, if you've got to create your own, it takes a little bit of creativity. It takes you got to think about it a little bit. So when you're trying to apply mnemonic devices, do it for information that is when it's absolutely necessary that you have to remember. Like if I absolutely have to remember exactly what the speed of light is, then I'm going to try to commit myself to memorizing this particular mnemonic device, which is a numbers to letters mnemonic. Now, we can also use mnemonic devices for music. And for those of you that play an instrument, you're probably already familiar with this, and if you're an experienced musician, then this doesn't even apply anymore, because now your memory, music, once you get past the basics, it becomes what they call procedural memory. Procedural memory is something that you remember like almost automatically, reflexively, kind of like playing a piano. If you're really good at the piano, your fingers are just moving very, very quickly based on looking at a sheet of music, right? And there are other procedural memories, like procedural memory would be, walking. If you play a sport like, let's say, basketball, shooting a basketball is a procedural kind of memory, or even typing. If you're a fast typer, well, typing is an example of procedural memory. So music as well, but when you're first learning music, you don't have that procedural memory. It takes a while to practice it. And with music, there are very, very specific things that you have to know, like, the treble clef. So for the treble clef, you can use the mnemonic device, and this is probably one of the most common mnemonic devices out there for people that learn music. Every good boy does fine. And if you're not familiar, this is for E, G, B, D, F on the treble clef. Now, these are referring to the lines, but also you have to keep in mind there's also spaces. And how do we remember the spaces? Well, for the spaces, we would remember face. So that's F, that's A, that's C, that's E. So lines are every good boy does fine. Spaces are face, and we just try to commit that to memory. And if we can commit that to memory, it's going to be easier to remember the treble clef. Now, there's also the bass clef. For the lines, you can try this one out. Good burritos don't fall apart. I would agree with that. I had someone wrap a burrito for me, and it fell apart one time, and it just fell all over the place, and that's not good. What about all cars eat grass? That would be for the spaces. Okay? Now, notice how this doesn't make any sense. All cars eat grass. Eat gas, I meant. No wonder it didn't make sense. I read that as grass. So you get the idea. The bass clef for the lines, you would remember this. For the spaces, you would remember this. And now we can put the treble clef and the bass clef, and let's put that all together. And here we go. We've got the top part here, which is the treble clef, the bottom part here for the bass clef, and we can remember face, every good boy does fine, all cars eat gas, and good burritos don't fall apart. Notice how it can all come together. And this is, again, a common mnemonic device for learning music. Now, other examples of, and this is probably, I would say, last but not least, how do I spell mnemonic? Because some people I know I always get tripped up for some reason. Just mnemonic, it doesn't sound the way it's spelled, really. There's an M, an M, E, O, and so on. Well, you can just remember mnemonic notes, effective, memorized on new ideas creatively. Notice how we kind of just pick it apart. And this is, again, just an example of saying, all right, I want to learn how to spell this word mnemonic, so I'm going to come up with some kind of maybe a sentence or an acronym that I can remember, and that'll help me remember. This actually helps you remember how to spell it and also what mnemonic devices are. So all of these things, here's how I want you to think about mnemonic devices. When do we actually need to use them? Okay? Because when you use them is important. Some people, when they try to use mnemonic devices, what they're doing is there are certain times where it's hard to apply them, but they can be applied creatively. So anytime, here are the things you need to know. If you've got a number, you want to probably use the letters to numbers mnemonic, and that's where you try to basically take let's say you have to remember the first number is 2, you take a word with 2 letters in it. Now, if you have to remember words like we had with the skull, where was that? What were we doing with the skull? We were basically creating an acrostic, which was taking the first letter of the thing that we had to remember and turning that into a sentence. Metric system, we did the same thing. We were taking the first letter and trying to put that into a sentence. Same thing with this. You come up with some kind of a story or a sentence that you can use, and that helps tremendously. Mnemonic devices, I want you to also know there are tons of them out there. You can actually find on the internet, if you just do a Google search. Let's say you're a law student and you're trying to You're just trying to learn. Let's say it's your first year in law school and you're being exposed to all these topics and you're struggling to remember them. Chances are you're not the first law student to be struggling with this. So why not search for, on Google, mnemonic devices for law students? Or if you're in medical school, why not mnemonic devices for medical school students? Or any other career field that you're in, you can probably, or anything that you're trying to learn. Anytime I've had to memorize something, and I found it difficult, and I try to come up with a mnemonic on my own, and let's say I can't come up with one, maybe I'm just not thinking creatively enough, I try to do a Google search mnemonic device, and then I'll put in the topic for what that is. And usually you can find something. So to summarize, make sure that you're creatively, you take a little bit of time to try and create a mnemonic device, try images, try to use acrostics, turning them into sentences, try the letters to numbers. There's a variety of ways that you can create mnemonic devices. Oh, one other way, and this is not even on the slides that I just thought of, the keypad on a phone, how the numbers correspond to 3 or 4 different letters. You can also, if you had to remember, let's say, a phone number, you can basically take that phone number and turn it into letters. Actually, advertisers know this very, very well. Instead of giving you a number like 1-800-372-4897, someone might say, okay, well, just dial 1-800-FLOWERS. Isn't that so much easier than trying to... So advertisers have known this for a while, so you can actually use, they call that the keypad mnemonic device, where you use the keypad to try and remember a series of numbers. So keep this in mind, and then all you have to look at is the keypad for it. If you have questions on mnemonics, or if you have a specific question of a mnemonic device that you're trying to figure out, and you want to kind of get some help, and you want to ask me what, here's what I have to memorize, can you help me memorize this? Feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to help you out and put some time and thinking power into it. If you can't figure it out on your own, that could be useful. Or do a Google search for it. If you have additional questions, you could also reach out to me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. And I want to thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you found it useful. I also want you to know that this webinar is part of a series that we're doing on memory improvement. And the other webinars that we're doing are dealing with different aspects. We're talking about mnemonic devices here. And mnemonic devices, again, keep in mind, they help you recall information. Now, they don't help you with the retention of information initially. They help you recall it, to basically pull it out of your brain. So if you need help with retention, we have other webinars that you can check out, such as how to remember more of what you read, how to remember names, how to remember long lists of information. We're actually going to be doing more webinars in this series, so you can check them out on our website. Or if you've signed up for this memory improvement course, you'll have access to all of them as soon as they're ready, or if they're already ready. We're going to be talking about the link system, the PEG system. There is a journey system, the memory palace system, the substitute word system, all of these systems, and we're going to have each webinar dedicated to a particular topic, because once you master the system, most of these systems don't take more than an hour to master. Some of them take, 30 minutes. Once you've mastered that system, you can apply it in a full variety of ways. So check out the other webinars, and thank you so much for coming out. If you want us to do this workshop or any of our memory or speed reading workshops at your company or at your school, feel free to get in touch with me or our support team. And we've done this at Harvard Business School. We've done this at a variety of colleges, also for employees of Google, for NASA. So we'd be happy to do it at your company and school, and you could reach out to me about that. Thank you all so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.